everyone. Thank you for attending this session. First, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, on whose land we now gather, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. We'd like to first introduce Laura Faulkner and Steve Legg. They're economists from the First Nation Economics Wellbeing Branch, the New South Wales Treasury. And I believe before this, Laura was with Deloitte, so it's like a return to home for her here. Laura and Steve will speak on First Nations investment framework, a work that was conducted as part of the Economic Strategy and Productivity Division. Laura and Steve will present an inclusive framework for reframing and enriching CBA to ensure that Indigenous cultural, social and economic perspectives are systematically included in how Australia measures the value of investments.
Thanks very much. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining our session. It's Laura, this is Steve, and we're going to run through a recap of the New South Wales Treasury First Nations investment framework and give you an update on its implementation. And I'll just echo Adria's acknowledgement of country that we're holding this session here on Gadigal land. I recognise the Gadigal people as the carers of this place for generations, guided by a sophisticated and evolving understanding of the interconnectivity of each part of the ecosystem, grounded in that cultural obligation to care for country and maintain a sustainable. I pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people participating in this session. And before we move into the content, it'd be great if you could scan the QR code. I know some of you have started that already. Or go to slido.com and enter this code here. I just wanted to ask some questions to get a sense of the audience and we can sort of tailor how we present from there. The first question is, how familiar are you with the First Nations investment framework? And we can see that it's pretty new to most of this group. And so that's great because there was a section on this last year. So that's probably a sign that there's a lot of people with sort of haven't had that background and presentation on it. So we'll cover that off for you today. And then for people who are familiar or have got a bit of understanding, I hope this will be a good recap for you and give you a bit more context on what we're doing next. The next question is, what is your experience with conducting culturally appropriate cost-benefit analyses? So yeah, pretty limited, which hopefully this will give you some tools and a bit more confidence and practical tips to sort of build that into your work. And the next question is just about what you hope to learn from this session. Yep, so putting into practice is a key kind of goal of the group, which is great. And so I'm just going to jump back to the slides. Yes, got it. Okay. I just want to check this out. Bring with us with the tech. So, the questions that the answer that you've given to those questions is really helpful. What we're going to do today is give a recap of the material from last year on the framework, and then go into an update on how we're supporting implementation, including some practical examples and tips. This session is intentionally less technical than many of the other sessions on today, While any CBA, of course, involves technical components, when it comes to genuinely improving the outcomes that are sought by First Nations people and communities, our research and engagement has emphasised that our ways of working are really the critical capability gap that needs to be addressed. So if we can embed lived experience, First Nations cultural perspectives, local community priorities into CBA, then that's going to be what gives us the tools to have more impactful proposals that come forward to investment decisions. So we can establish those partnerships. We can then work together to navigate those valuation challenges that we're experiencing on a day-to-day basis as CBA analysts. And it's really important that that work is undertaken together. So hopefully we give you some examples and tips on how to embed that in your work today. To give you a quick introduction, Steve and I are part of Treasury's Centre for Economic Evidence that Alex spoke about this morning. We work in the First Nations Economic Wellbeing branch, and we have both policy and advisory functions with a First Nations focus. So Alex, who opened this morning, and Kusha, who's speaking later this afternoon, are colleagues of ours in the Investment and Evaluation Policy branch in CEE. But yeah, there's also an advisory team that looks at sort of high risk, high value CBA and provides advice and stuff to inform ERC decisions. And we do a little bit of both of those things, but yeah, with a First Nations focus. Our branch was established in 2020, and our mission is to support the New South Wales Government's core business practices and ways of working so that we're integrating First Nations values, perspectives, and aspirations. This next slide here highlights some of our work streams and publications. Today, we're going to focus on the evidence component on the left, but if you're interested in some of these other areas, including information on the First Nations business sector or First Nations women's economic participation, please have a look at our website for those documents, or also feel free to reach out to us because we'd love to have a chat. I'm just going to pass on to Steve now to talk through the framework.
Probably the most exciting thing, it's out. So back end of last year, that year has gone very, very quickly. It's out. It's got practical guidance to support agencies to work with First Nations people. Materials relevant, not just to First Nations initiatives, but any initiative that has impact on First Nations people. And it addresses common gaps in current knowledge. So 4 years of research and consultation to identify what those gaps are, plug them basically. So it supplements the existing suite of investment framework across New South Wales Government. There's requirements, recommendations and guidance for stages of initiatives development, appraisal, monitoring and evaluation. It applies across everything, so projects, programs, regulations and policies. And it's non-mandatory supplementary guidance. So there's guidance there, good practice for appraisal and evaluation. It'll help build the evidence base needed for informed investment decisions and prioritise resources where they are most effective. That's a pretty key part in closing the gap and Aboriginal programs. It's a real acknowledgement that there's no new money. So a lot of the improvements we need to make need to come out of reprioritisation. And it'll improve the quality and appropriateness of evaluations of First Nations initiatives, leading to better outcomes for Aboriginal people. What do you actually get, I guess? So there's 5 steps there. How to get the foundations right. So there's a continuum in there from cultural awareness to cultural capability to cultural safety. Only Aboriginal people can tell us if they're culturally safe. Key principles, so trust, accountability, mutual respect. How to work in partnership. So bear in mind, we've got very diverse communities across New South Wales. So we've just been out far west, south coast. The protocols for engaging are different depending on where you are. So there's some flexibility here, but an emphasis on shared decision making rather than just consultation. Community-led design, so outcomes defined with Aboriginal people. The importance of community perspectives. So often I've been sent out in the past, I haven't always been at Treasury, I've been agency side. I've been sent out to consult on things where the outcomes have already been defined. That doesn't go very well. What we want to do, best practice, is actually defining those outcomes with the community. And I guess bear in mind the timeframes don't always match up. sometimes where they're end of financial year trying to move money out the door or on an election cycle. For communities, it's intergenerational. It's what grandma did for me, what I'm going to do for my grandkids. And qualitative outcomes, particularly cultural outcomes, shouldn't be overlooked just because they're hard to measure. You've still got to give them a treat. Very important. Advice on data collection, so particularly around Aboriginal data governance and sovereignty. Using data that's meaningful to First Nations people. So an understanding of what types of data and information are important to First Nations people, what's required to effectively design and evaluate First Nations initiatives. So you want your collection methods to be informed by First Nations methodologies, so you ensure that they're culturally safe, ethical, respectful, and culturally appropriate. There's also advice on how to be accountable to community. That varies. One way we're doing that at the moment in the Far West with Murdi-Parky Regional Assembly, we just keep a register of all the actions and issues that have been raised. So that's there. They can always come back to us and say, well, Steve, where did you get to with that one? It actually frees me up in a lot of ways too, because once they know that's all written down, there's less pressure to do it in the time. They know that it's all written up. And CBA appendix. So CBA is our preferred approach here at Treasury, and the appendix provides supplementary guidance to TPG 2308, the New South Wales Government Guide to Cost Benefit Analysis. So prior knowledge of TPG 2308 is assumed, and then the appendix addresses each step of CBA with specific guidance on conducting CBA for First Nations initiatives. So the scope, it applies to all First Nations specific initiatives, but anything that has an impact on Aboriginal communities should be applying the framework. Does not have mandatory requirements, supplements existing guidance around business case development, cost benefit analysis and evaluation. There's no prescriptive checklist. There's no silver bullet. You've got to do the hard work on this one. It may seem hard to put into practice, but it reflects the reality that policies and programs vary. There really is no just silver bullet to this. You've got to actually go out and work with communities. And the guidance is applicable at all stages of the life cycle of an initiative, with an emphasis on early engagement. So when you're defining a case for change, all the way through to developing options and eventually evaluating. Back to you, Laura.
So I'm going to talk a bit about the CBA appendix. So as Steve mentioned, this is really giving us extra guidance on when and how to embed the 5 steps within the main body of the framework when you're going through CBA. And it's really, the sort of how to work, like preparing for CBA, how do you develop relationships, establish partnerships, use that to develop your options, identify those outcomes and benefits, and then together measure those benefits in a culturally appropriate and meaningful way, whether it's qualitatively or quantitatively. And we've got a worked example throughout that chapter to demonstrate sort of how you can put that into practice. And I just also wanted to reinforce what Steve said about the guidance isn't just restricted to First Nations targeted initiatives, but when you're working on general initiatives, please consider as well early on if there's likely to be a First Nations impact that you should consider in your approach. So that could include impacts on First Nations land interests or cultural heritage. You could be looking at a capital project in an area with a high Aboriginal population, or an initiative that's expected to impact on one of the outcomes in sort of the closing the gap socioeconomic targets. So we know from research and experience, and the Australian Productivity Commission summarised this really well in one of their reports, these initiatives are more likely to work if they're evidence-based, if they're designed, developed and delivered with First Nations people and communities, and if they're flexible and adaptable to the local context. A key focus of the appendix is applying the economic framework of culture that's introduced in Chapter 4 around community-led design. So this is a framework we've developed based on the research about how First Nations cultures have been incorporated in CBA to date. And really it's about recognising that when you're designing a program, it's really helpful to think about First Nations cultures potentially as an asset. So culture can be both an input to and an outcome of initiatives. And in doing so, enhance a range of broader economic, social and environmental outcomes. So to help support how this role of culture can be recognised and articulated in business cases and CBAs, the framework sets out 5 different effects or pathways through which this can occur, which are these boxes through the middle of the slide. And a lot of these are drawn from institutional economic theory, such as Eleanor Ostrom's institutional analysis and development framework, really recognising the significance of institutions in governing common pool resources, facilitating cooperation, sharing information, and solving collective action problems. So by recognising the contribution of First Nations cultures, not just as outcomes, which are obviously really important and core to why people and communities practice culture, but also as critical inputs that reflect, you can then reflect in CBA that incremental contribution of cultural factors by looking at the different effect sizes on those broader outcomes. So the worked example through the CBA appendix focuses on land management. It's a hypothetical example, but it compares how a CBA analyst might look at 2 different options. So option A that we sort of shaped up, option 1, it's on the slide. This involves investing in Aboriginal community-controlled organisations to run land management programs. And option B, or option 2, is about creating new positions for First Nations people within government land management agencies to carry out the existing scope of work. And so we talk through drawing on like the research in sort of this sort of space. Obviously, option B is likely to deliver net benefits from the application of cultural knowledge. It could potentially increase labour surplus benefits and also provide health and wellbeing benefits from giving First Nations people opportunities to work on country and practice land management. And compared to the first option, it's also likely to be faster and cheaper to implement. But in comparison, the research does suggest that the scale of potential benefits under the first option is likely to be higher over the medium to long term. This is because it provides that more self-determined, flexible approach where local ACOs can lead projects on local country. That's going to give them opportunities to apply the specific place-based knowledge and cultural practices to achieve those environmental outcomes. ACOs would also likely have greater capacity than government agencies to be matching local First Nations people to employment opportunities on their country based on their existing community networks. There's also opportunities for cultural knowledge sharing, adhering to cultural protocols and strengthening those bonds within the community. There could also be opportunities to demonstrate sort of and contribute towards broader community outcomes. For example, when an ACO is in a local community and they understand the needs of the community and the people, and they can, they're more likely to be able to draw in. So, for example, if there's a gap in the connections between youth and the elders, they might see that opportunity and create that opportunity for them to connect through the program delivery, whereas for a government agency, it's a bit harder to put that into play without those existing relationships. And that's really got potential flow and impacts in education, for example, given that we know that First Nations young people who feel good about their culture at school are more likely to aspire to finish Year 12 and pursue further study. So this is just an illustrative example. It shows how cultural inputs can be considered and valued in CBA, and there's growing research to support those flow and input impacts that link cultural elements to broader outcomes. And what we really want to see is agencies, through their evaluation of existing programs, really focus on looking at how we can measure this in evaluations processes after programs are implemented to help strengthen that economic evidence to support future funding decisions. So now in terms of how the framework overall is being applied, a key point to note is that it's now sort of embedded in the annual budget process. So while the framework itself is not mandatory, because we didn't want to set a sort of prescribed way in which you need to work with communities, because every program and every community is different, there is a separate policy that was introduced last year called the First Nations Impact Assessment Policy. This is required for all First Nations specific measures, but also measures that will significantly or disproportionately impact the socio-economic outcomes or interests of First Nations people or communities. And it applies to all new measures. So it might be proposals that are seeking funding through the budget, but also where agencies are seeking government decisions on policy, legislation or regulation, they need to complete that kind of template as well. And so the framework here is the how-to guide to give you the skills to then be able to complete that assessment at a sort of high standard and give the agencies a higher likelihood of getting funded. And yeah, so once you follow this guide, completing that is going to be more straightforward. the two mechanisms are working hand in hand to achieve the same goals. One example of something that was funded in this year's budget is the investment into creating 15 new Aboriginal community-controlled early childhood and education and care services. This decision was made recognising the importance of ACCOs in early childhood education and care service delivery that really celebrates and actively practices culture, the role that ACCOs play in building strong relationships with children and families, which can in turn support improved outcomes. And so that strategy, this is called the First Step strategy, which is sort of being extended. It's got sort of three main goals, focused on the child, focused on the connections with family and kinship, and that families feel respected and safe, and then how those two things flow into the learning outcomes for the child and child development. And that really plays a role in building that child's identity and confidence to then grow and develop. An important feature of this proposal is the governance and the way that it was developed. So the New South Wales Department of Education has established Gudjagang Gulgul, the Aboriginal Early Childhood Education and Care Committee, which comprises of Aboriginal representatives in this field. And these experts have informed the development of this strategy since 2021. But the role of the committee hasn't stopped now that funding's been extended, but it's in fact continuing into program implementation and also the delivery phase in setting up these new ACCOs. The next example I've got is about Aboriginal languages and how really understanding the significance of cultural practice is important when we're shaping policy and program responses. So I'll just play a short video from the Aboriginal Languages Trust.
Country is not just land, it's our heartbeat. It carries our stories, our ancestors, our languages, our cultures. Country is the foundation to our language and people. It carries the fibres that teach us and sustains our cultural well-being.
Ngutana logal no. Ngana logal no. Winangara logal no. Yano walam mai.
When we learn language through country, we connect with meaning and knowledges, deepening our relationship with our land, with ourselves, and each other. Our languages are more than just words. They tell us about the seasons, the songs of birds. They carry knowledges that have sustained our culture since the beginning of time. Languages live in country. Learning language through country enriches our minds, our spirits, strengthening the cultural identities of our communities. But accessing country isn't always easy. Barriers like private land and red tape limit our ability to share and learn through country. Our teachers face a legacy of policies that prohibit learning language through country. But Aboriginal languages are reawakening across the state. Working together, we can pave the way for future generations to revitalise our languages and to speak them on country and to speak with country again. Country is not just land.
So there are around 35 different Aboriginal languages across New South Wales, often crossing borders with other states and territories or other states. And yeah, just if you're not familiar with the work of the Trust, it was set up after the commencement of the Aboriginal Languages Act to provide a sustained, focused and coordinated approach to First Nations language activities across New South Wales, recognising that needs to take place at a local level as well as regional and statewide. And the video here is really showing us how the role of language it connects people to place, it connects the past to the present, it helps build relationships between people and how you need to think about these different factors. And that understanding, from a non-First Nations person's perspective is really, I guess, might not be so immediately obvious, but it's really integral to the cultural identity of First Nations people. And it beds that generational knowledge in a way of the way that the local environment works and how communities can care for country. So that spoken expression of culture, while it's not easily measured or valued in a quantitative sense, it's fundamental. And so the Languages Trust is leading research into the flow and impacts of language practice. And that's starting to reveal benefits in terms of health and well-being, educational engagement and aspirations, and also employment through opportunities in teaching language and also other kind of cultural services. So understanding this is obviously really key to, one, understanding why the vitalisation, renewal and the reawakening of First Nations languages is significant, but also thinking about what are the sort of policy and program settings that need to be in place to support language practice in the most effective way. So the video talked about barriers to access to country for language, and so that's obviously going to vary from place to place, and the sort of a one-size-fits-all approach won't work. So that's kind of an example of the role that the Trust is playing in trying to address those barriers informed by different community perspectives.
So we're taking a change management approach to this. So it's not just capability building. It's a whole lot of systems that need to be reformed across government to actually close the gap. I presented the First Nations Investment Framework Secretaries Board. So if you're from outside government, that's the heads of all 12 agencies. And Edwina, Chan and I have since then been briefing executive leadership teams across government on the framework. So we've been doing a lot of capability building through these sorts of forums. So everyone familiar with that 70-20-10 type approach to performance development, where 10% of it's formal learning, 20% sort of through your peer networks and managers, and then 70% is actually doing. So I guess that's kind of a call to arms a little bit. We actually need people to go out and start doing this. Like 70% of the learning, I think, will actually come from practitioners like yourselves going out and doing this. And we've also been applying it. We've developed an Aboriginal specific forward evaluation schedule, so similar to the evidence bank but for Aboriginal initiatives, and we'll be applying it to new policy proposals as they come through, both the FNIA side and the investment framework side. And people like Laura have been out working on the Aboriginal Child and Family Centres to apply it, and we've been working with Justice on the Aboriginal-led commissioning. So we've been out on the road, so we're making this thing real. So been down to places like Shoalhaven, out to Dubbo, and this one will focus on our recent Far West trip. So we went to places like Ivanhoe, Hobart, Broken Hill, Menindee and Wilcannia. Really taught me about the importance of listening and critical self-reflection, which we've got advice on in the framework. I kind of thought we'd talk to them about issues like housing and employment, which we did, but the people like Broken Hill, Menindee, Wilcannia, they're Barkandji people. Barker is the Darling River, so people of the river. There was a lot of emphasis on water policy and the environment, which I hadn't sort of expected. So, there's a bit of sort of self-reflection and learning all the way through it. This is a long-standing governance group, the Verde Park Regional Assembly. I remember going out, I met with a guy, Des Jones, in debt back in 2008. So they were well established 20 years ago. They're still going. There's 16 community working parties, and a real key thing to remember, the community's already done a lot of the work. So they've got housing, environmental health plans, community action plans, the workforce strategy. So there's a real, taking that partnership approach, you've kind of got to do your homework before you get out there. This will be hard to read, but sort of just take it as what it is. Thinking back to our partnerships chapter, we talked a bit about flexibility and how you engage with different regions. For Verde Parky, this is how they want NGOs, government to engage with them. So they've got an engagement protocol there. It doesn't mean you don't engage with other stakeholders out there like local Aboriginal land councils, but Murdy Park is a good place to start, and they've got established protocols. Just a reminder on some of the advice that's available from the ethics organisations. So IATSIS and NHMRC, there's some deep advice in there. So, for example, around cultural responsibilities. So just remember, from kind of a ethics engagement perspective, Aboriginal people have a whole bunch of cultural obligations to care for country, maintain kinship connections. When we bring them in for consultations or onto a project, we're taking them away from that. So we need to value their time and competing priorities. So what are we doing to support implementation? As I sort of mentioned before, we've got that change management approach. So we've got video summaries by chapter, capacity building through additional resources and case studies. We're looking at doing training modules and workshops. We're open to feedback on that, what you think might be useful. Ongoing engagement with groups like the Evidence Bank Working Group, and of course with our key partners, so New South Wales Coalition of Aboriginal Peak Organisations, who we partner with on Closing the Gap, and the New South Wales Coalition of Aboriginal Regional Alliances, which that Murdy Parky group kind of maps up to as part of OCA local decision making. And we'll be leveraging this next round of new policy proposals coming through to provide feedback out to people on their business cases and the Aboriginal specific initiatives forward evaluation schedule that we've built. So we'll be next year working with agencies on their evaluation approaches, like how are they embedding the investment framework? Is it useful to them? What's it changed? And I think we're into questions and discussion.
Thank you, Steve and Laura. It's actually really interesting, and I mean I'm one of those who knew a little bit about it, but not much. And I think what you said was really resonated with me. What you said about getting out there in the community and not making these assumptions, not going there with assumptions, and starting that conversation, that partnership with the communities, because they are varied. That difference between you thinking that they want to talk about housing and actually they want to talk about the environment. I mean, that's really important. Any questions from the floor?
Harley Smith from the Department of DeFi. Can you comment on the relationship between this framework and the other business case templates and evaluation templates? Do you expect this to be like a standalone project, or for people to incorporate this framework into their business cases as like an appendix, or I'm after the
Supplementary.
Yeah, I'd say, when you're doing, this won't change. This stuff should be embedded throughout, I guess, the whole process of your business case development. So it's not an attachment off to the side, but embedded throughout. So for example, when you're talking about the options that are being compared, you hopefully can draw on that economic framework of culture to help describe the differences between them and why certain outcomes might have different effect sizes when you've got different levels of cultural inputs.
You don't necessarily need a standalone document at the end just to use these principles within the business case template or within the evaluation template to check off that you're meeting the criteria of what you're on about.
That's correct. Although, because the government's got this increased focus at the moment, you will still need to do the First Nations impact assessment document, which I think it's like 5 questions you've got to answer, but that can be relatively short. If you've got a really strong business case that's already embedding these principles, you should be able to find answering those questions quite straightforward. But yeah, if the information's all in that attachment and not in the body of the business case, then the Treasury analyst will be sort of questioning, is this legit or is it just a tack on, right? So hopefully what we like to see is you put that emphasis through the business case process, because, the questions we're thinking about when we look at it is, who's been involved in this? How do we know that what's being presented here matters to those communities and is actually going to make a difference? So that's what we want to see. that attachment is just a kind of supplementary piece at the moment to help sure we've got that focus and as a sort of extra mandatory tool to draw it out, particularly in cases where it hasn't been made clear.
Other question? Oh, I was gonna.
That was really good. Thank you. Very interesting. I was wondering so I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's something like the Aboriginal population of Australia is something like 4% of the population. So pretty much every program is likely to involve some Aboriginal people. So I was just wondering, for programs that aren't directly targeted at Aboriginal people, but say it's a health program or something, how do you incorporate this?
Yeah, look, it depends. So we've gone from being something like 2% of the population when I first started work to around 4% in New South Wales now. And by 2041, will be more than 7% of the population. And then 70% of Aboriginal people live regionally. So depending on the context, there'll be greater or lesser impact. But for some agencies like Communities and Justice, everything is, where 45% of the kids in out-of-home care and I think 30% of the people in jail. So really for them, like almost anything they do, it's had like significant Aboriginal impact.
So I think start the conversation with the relevant partners. So in the health space, obviously the Regional Medical Services and the peak bodies that sit around that, I guess identify, if there's a particular health issue that's prominent, that's going to be more prominent and less prominent in certain places. You want to really dive down to that local level of information and think about what's the best way that we're going to deliver the service, for example, to really make people feel trusted that they can seek out that advice and then, apply for that health advice and practice into their day-to-day.
Does anybody have a question? I'll ask the question. This is a follow-on from the first question about basically it seems clear to me that any assessment that has an environmental impact need to actually include First Nations like community involvement, because it involves land, it involves water. So is it, or will it be mandatory for an inclusion in all future assessments?
I'd probably say differently. I think Aboriginal outcomes considered as business as usual in everything we do would be the aspiration. But then on a business case by business case basis, some have significant Aboriginal impact and should be following best practice, and others where there's less, you can kind of shape what you've done in terms of saying, well, there's been consultation and engagement rather than co-design or partnering. But the preference would be that everything would go to that partnering and co-design type approach. And the effects show up in surprising ways. We had one recently about changes to the fine system in New South Wales. And one of the leading drivers for Aboriginal people in jail is unauthorised driving offences. So if we do things at Revenue New South Wales around mitigating the effects of fines, flows through to the justice system. But those effects are not always immediately obvious. All the more reason to do that early engagement Laura was talking about, so that the peak bodies can say, actually, this has been an issue for a long time. Thanks for talking to us about it.
Other questions?
Hi, thank you very much. It was very interesting. I was wondering, so with many of the things that you talked about, like case studies, they're like qualitative analysis that we can do. Is Treasury working on just like some framework how to quantify and measure the impact? Or is there any part like with the tools, CBA tools that we had earlier today that the Treasury has developed? Is there any part that we can just like refer to that part in the tool to see how to measure?
So I guess depends on what type of benefits or outcomes and then benefits you're trying to measure in the CBA. So you can think of there'll be some benefits that are, or outcomes that are things related to culture, cultural practice, cultural engagement of that, which has, you know, that value for those people that are participating in it just inherently, if that makes sense, or, you know, the existence value of languages, you know, that I might place a value on that. So, you know, non-market valuation studies can be applied, and there's some advice in the CBA appendix about how you might go about that. But what's really critical is that you do that in partnership with whoever's working on the project with you. So you're framing those questions right in the survey and doing it in a culturally appropriate way. The other side of the coin is the things that we're generally measuring pretty well already in CBA, like labour surplus impacts or educational flow and benefits, or health cost savings and things like that. You know, we've got established mechanisms and things and methods to quantify those things. And so what you really want to be looking at is what's that change in the outcome that's being delivered by, you know, doing this through a Aboriginal community controlled organisation. So that's when you're looking at the research for that particular type of service or program. So for example, if you're looking at maternity services, there's an example, like a really high quality outcome evaluation that was done for a program in Brisbane, which found that introducing like an ACO delivered health service for pregnant women, you know, in a community controlled hub with access to broader services. They had a transport service to help people get to their appointments. When they evaluated it and sort of controlled for differences in patient characteristics, they still found something like a 40% reduction in preterm births. So, you know, you can then pick up that in measuring the health cost savings from that method, and that's also partly attributable to culture.
What I just add to that, there's also, I've come across, I've partly worked on actually on the first step strategy. There's also a little bit of work done in the federal level around, so IP Australia, for example, they've got a paper on basically methods to estimate the value of knowledge, cultural knowledge, and they provide like advice around how best to approach those things. So like, you know, engaging with the community. So it's kind of like supplementary to what's just actually.
Thank you.
Yeah, Martin Howell from Sydney Uni. It seems, and it's a really great framework, and the material behind it is really useful. Valuing cultural inputs is the easy bit, because, you know, it might be a mums and bubs program or a dad going to men, and so you put a dollar value, and so on. It's the cultural outcome that I think is the difficult one.
Yeah, that's difficult. So when we've looked through CBAs, there's not really been any solid work that's transferable in that space yet. I think it partly reflects cultural sensitivities of applying sort of westernized valuation approaches, and you know, that can be conflicting to some people who say, are you trying to put a price on what my culture means to me, that kind of argument. And so, yeah, it hasn't really been tested yet. I think it's possible, and it's just a matter of coming up, finding the right partners and exploring that together. So yeah, and then where we can't quantify things, like there's a lot of outcomes in CBA that we can't quantify and that we consider qualitatively, and I think that flows into some of those points this morning, that it shouldn't just be that focus on that single VCR number, but the whole picture. And so weaving this qualitative evidence into the analysis is something we're trying to encourage as well, where it can't be quantified. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we have 1 minute for questions, but I think maybe we'll just finish off there. I think Unica's got. Oh no, I got Andrea. It's just you don't mind doing it. So we do it at the end. You're going to say about it. I think thank you. Can we say thank you to Laura and Steve for